the first thing that really struck me is that from a macroeconomic perspective, we're seeing the role of industry and technology coming in through the Chinese private sector as a role of updating African manufacturing capacity. I think if you look at the way a lot of either older manufacturing players in Africa or some of the newer ones, there has been a struggle around integrating innovative and effective technology into how they operate. So I think it's been really quite interesting to see how the Chinese presence is playing that updating role. On the other side, there is this tension where we're seeing this sort of almost second wave of the industrialization that's informed by Chinese presence. Obviously, the first wave of premature deindustrialization, we could argue, happened sort of in the early 90s, when I think many African countries opened their markets, having not industrialized. And so the uptake of the manufacturing capacity in China itself sort of informed this premature deindustrialization. So I think it's interesting seeing this new rise where there's an anchoring in of Chinese manufacturing and investment activity in Africa, but not necessarily in a manner that centers indigenous players. And it will be interesting to look at the implications of premature industrialization in terms of the African players, rather than just the presence of industry. I think the third big thing that really struck me was this issue around productivity and the incentives to be productive. I think their assumption always is that, African labor, it may be cheap, but it's not productive. This is a problem. But I think what this research really articulated, I think quite lucidly, is that the motivations for pushing for productivity depend on market access, right? So I think to the point that both Dr. Tang and Linda made, when you're dealing with very fragmented markets, number one, and where you're dealing with in a context where there's not a lot of market information in terms of allowing firm level decisions to decide which markets to expand to, whether that's within Africa or using, for example, the tariff structures that a lot of African economies have for mature economies. If that knowledge isn't there, then sort of the push towards being productive for the sake of being productive, I think is something to think about. And I think it will be interesting to see going forward the spaces where enabling African labor to be more productive actually makes sense and pays off, and the spaces where there's a bit more flexibility around, this sort of new obsession with the productivity of African labor. So I found that very interesting in terms of the link to market access.